Okay, folks, well, thanks for coming along tonight, and thanks for those who are following us on Zoom, and will see us later on our website. And tonight we have Peter Lerner, who I'll introduce briefly. I should say at the start, thanks to the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council for facilitating this function this evening and putting us in touch with the speaker at our request. So that's great to have Peter Lerner here. So I'll introduce him very briefly. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner is Director General of the International Relations of the General Federation of Labour in Israel. He's retired from the Israel Defence Forces, where he was a Lieutenant Colonel and more recently international spokesman for Israel, and he would have been seen on television screens in English-speaking countries at that time. And so we're very grateful to have Peter Lerner here tonight, and the topic is Israel at war, Gaza, Lebanon and Iran. Peter Lerner, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Thanks for coming to listen to me and my funny English accent. If we are talking about the subject of Gaza, Hezbollah and Iran, I think first of all we need to turn it upside down, because none of the instability in our region would be possible without the interference of Iran. Iran is the puppet master of everything negative happening in our region. And indeed, the war that broke out on the 7th of October would not have been possible without Iran's funding, training, equipping of Hamas. And indeed, Iran is continuing today to fund Hamas, to fund Hezbollah, to fund and equip the Houthis in Yemen. And as such, the question is, I believe, what are we going to do about Iran? And there is absolutely a necessity to, first and foremost, look at Iran front and center and identify the problem, because any solution to any problem first requires that we identify the problem. So if we look at Iran and we see everything that they're up to in the Middle East, they are trying to solidify or broaden the scope of their hegemony in the region and project power across the region. And they're doing it through proxy wars, but also extensive financial support. And their intent to become a nuclear power is precisely because they want to solidify themselves as a regional superpower, as they were for many, many years in the history of Persia. So as we look to everything that we see today, we always need to keep in mind that it is happening under this Iranian umbrella. Over the course of 8 months, I served as an international spokesperson for the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. And I'm here to talk a bit about that experience and how we saw the war with Hamas develop. Indeed, I woke up in the early hours of the 7th of October after a family vacation. And we were watching, we were awoken by the alarms that sounded in central Israel, where I live, in the town of Ramat Gan, which is just east of Tel Aviv. And we woke up to these sirens, we went down to our shelter, and the intensity of the sirens indicated immediately that it was something different. Nothing we'd endured before. In the first few hours, there were several thousands of rockets fired at Israel. The application on my phone was ringing off the top extensively. It woke my wife up. We went down to the shelter. And as we were standing in our shelter, I was watching on social media how things were developing, because Hamas wanted to project what they were doing. They wanted to tell the world how they were infiltrating into Israel and how they were committing the attack, what they call the Al-Aqsa flood. And indeed, they flooded Israel. We came up from the shelter in our apartment in Ramat Gan, and we were watching the television, and what I saw was the extensive rockets coming over into Israel on one hand, but also the paragliders coming over the fence in southern Israel near the Nova Party, but also near Kfar Aza. And they were penetrating the border on approximately 30 different locations. Around a total of around 3,000 terrorists came into Israel on that morning and throughout the several hours of that day. And they conducted an unfathomable attack against the soft underbelly of Israel. Now, Israel, as you may well know, has endured wars, has endured terrorism, has endured conflict, but never in the history of the State of Israel have we had to endure such an onslaught on Israeli civilians in one day at any given stage. Indeed, 1,200 Israelis were killed, murdered, massacred on that morning. 240 or so were abducted into the Gaza Strip by Hamas because they sought to create as much disruption and death and destruction to Israeli society. What were they trying to achieve? How are they trying to achieve it? There are many questions that still remain answered. I think one of the things that I did as a civilian on the 7th of October was I sat down and I jotted down the failures of the IDF. And I published those failures in the Jerusalem Post on the morning after, on the 8th of October. And I identified 3 failures that the IDF had done. They failed strategically to identify that Hamas was, over the course of 17 years, building its power to be prepared for this war. They had built an extensive underground tunnel system, most expensive, expansive construction project ever to exist in the Gaza Strip. Not for the benefit of the people of Gaza, but only to secure and solidify their control and security of the Hamas terrorists themselves. They utilized all of the powers of government, from the different ministries to the building of the forces in order to be prepared for conducting the attack on the 7th of October. And over the course of the last 17 years, with every engagement, every conflict that we'd had with Hamas or with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they were watching us very closely, learning and implementing the lessons learned from those conflicts. So if in 2014 that most of their efforts were focused on building tunnels that penetrate into Israel to do cross-border attacks, and once Israel severed that capability, they evolved and they developed more capabilities. So the paragliders is one, and then they thought, why do we need to invest so much beneath ground to attack Israel if we can just attack the fence and storm into Israel? And effectively, that's what they did. They did it with over the course of the years because they had financial support on one hand, but they had the benefit of the cushioning of the international community, international organizations that support the Palestinian people in Gaza, and by supporting them with social welfare capabilities, with health institutions, with medical institutions, with education, with schools, effectively the international community was excusing Hamas from their civic responsibilities to the people of Gaza. So everything Iran was giving them, everything Qatar was feeding them, was all going into their diabolical plan to build this terrorist army. The failures of the IDF on the 7th of October, and I'm mindful of the time because I've been told I will be publicly humiliated. The failures of the IDF on the 7th of October are 3 failures. First of all, the misunderstanding of Hamas's intentions. I mentioned that briefly. Israel did not prepare, perhaps for convenience, because there was no interest in creating one front out of the Palestinian arena. Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, it served a political interest of not having to deal with the Palestinian Authority, because who do they represent? If they don't control Gaza, Hamas controls Gaza, you can't really negotiate anything for security or peace or anything of that sort, because who represents who? So strategically, Israel did not identify the intentions of Hamas. Operationally, on the level of operations and intelligence, the IDF failed to prepare its forces for a mass invasion into Israel. The reality, or the misreading of those intentions led to the fact that the frontier on the border with Gaza was underfunded. The amount of forces that needed to be in place were not in place because the threat was perceived to be elsewhere. And the reality that actually evolved on the 7th of October created this new infiltration, despite the fact that there were some indications picked up by Israeli intelligence identifying that this could be an option. And finally, the third component, the third failure that I identify is the tactical failure. So when the strategic failure was failed, when the operational failure misled, the last line of defense is the forces, the tactical forces on the ground that should have been equipped and prepared to prevent an infiltration. They too were ill-prepared, leading to the mass invasion into the civilian communities of southern Israel. And today we look at the frontier with Gaza and we see a war that has developed since then, a war that has two goals in mind. First of all, and I believe it is the most important goal, to bring back the hostages. Today there are 120 hostages still being held hostage by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They have shown willingness to negotiate for a hostage release in return for prisoners in Israeli prisons, Palestinian prisoners. And I believe that Israel needs to increase military pressure to ensure that Hamas negotiate. Only under the threat of the sword will Hamas concede to some negotiations, out of the understanding that maybe they will be able to survive. But they will only do that if their back's up to the wall. So we have to be determined that we will bring back the hostages and we will create the opportunity, the operational reality on the ground to bring around to that hostage release. The second, which is equally important, that this war cannot bring us back to square one, meaning Hamas can't be trusted with the powers of government. They can't have that power to build a terrorist army ever again. We can see that they can't be trusted with that power because with that power they build a terrorist army that infiltrates into Israel with the intention of massacre, murder and abduction. And so the outcome of this war, and we are now 9 months in, where we have, and the military, the IDF, has been able to destroy approximately half of Hamas's fighting force, including the most senior commanders, including the brigade-level commanders, including dismantling almost all of the battalions, the organized combat that they can conduct. And so the degradation of their capabilities to fight is an ongoing battle, and I believe that we need to pursue that until Hamas have no ability to conduct battle. But I will say, we should not look at each and every tunnel and say each and every tunnel is the goal. No, we need to negate the capabilities and negate the motivation of Hamas to fight. That can only be a result of the offensive capabilities on one hand, but also the prospect that something will be different at the end, that there will be a change at the end of this war. There are three components that are challenging in this war in Gaza. Primarily, the fact that we're conducting combat in an urban area, densely populated, with something like 2.2 million Palestinians living in an area, which is surrounded by Israel on the north and on the east, and by Egypt on the south. And if Israel wants to have a new relationship with the Gaza Strip, a different relationship, a relationship which is beneficial to safety and security, we must look at safety and security not only for Israelis, but also for Palestinians. I believe that in the course of this war, Egypt has been part and parcel of, or should have been part and parcel of the solution of combat in urban areas. So they should have been part of the solution to evacuate civilians from harm's way. It's not enough to shift people within the Gaza Strip because combat is ongoing. Hamas has built this terror tunnel system in order to conceal their activities. They have no regard for the international humanitarian law or for the laws of armed conflict. They just don't care. On the contrary, they abuse those locations, whether it's schools, mosques, international symbols such as United Nations. They abuse those precisely to try and create a reality where Israel cannot conduct its activities against them. They see all of the civilian arena as their iron dome, Israel's defense mechanism against Hamas's rockets. So they use the civilian arena precisely to protect themselves. Egypt could have opened the border for women and children, for instance. Unfortunately, there was no international outcry on Egypt to do so. Israel did not do that because of the strategic relationship we have, but everybody else did not have that binding responsibility towards Egypt, which I think could have been beneficial to everybody in the region. Hamas is the enemy of everybody decent in the region. There is no talk of any peace between Israel and the Palestinians as long as Hamas control the Gaza Strip. And therefore, anybody that is interested in any prospects of peace, no matter what or how your personal preference of that peace looks like, needs to be very clear that Hamas cannot control the Gaza Strip. So the operation is moving forward. The civilian impact of conflict, whether it's the humanitarian control, the evacuation of people from harm's way, the ongoing flow of hundreds of thousands of tons of humanitarian supplies into Gaza continues. And it does have an impact. But there are challenges that Israel is facing on the international stage, which are, I would say, twofold. First of all, my background of operating and working within the media, we have a media that is extremely charged against Israel. They're very, very focused on the human impact of war, which is natural. But sometimes less natural, the automatically knee-jerk response of accepting anything Hamas says and questioning anything Israel or the IDF says. And the second component on the international arena is the international humanitarian organizations. So they're supposed to be impartial players, but they are anything but impartial. And I say that precisely because 2 years ago, we were looking towards the World Health Organization in anticipation for them to tell us, and we couldn't sit like this 2 years ago, we would have masks on. We would ask them, what type of masks should we have to protect ourselves? But throughout the course of this war, the World Health Organization has not mentioned once the systematic abuse of Hamas of hospitals. So the failures of the international system, that's just one example, and because of the time that I'm wary of, I could go through a whole list of every single organization. UNICEF, UNRWA, the International Committee of the Red Cross. All of these organizations have failed to present the problem. The problem is Hamas. If you can't say the problem, you can't find a solution. And that, I think, is probably my biggest frustration. And I am a self-professed internationalist. My role in the international department, as leading the international department of Israel's Federation of Labor, the Histadrut, is to be that bridge between Israeli workers and the workers of the world. And the failure of the international system cannot be more stark than this war against Hamas. Hamas embodies everything that is evil, but is being protected by an international community. Hezbollah, Lebanon. Lebanon is a country being held hostage by a terrorist army. Hezbollah makes Hamas look like amateur hour. On the 8th of October, out of solidarity for their brothers in Gaza, Hezbollah began launching rockets, launching attacks, attempted 7 attempts to infiltrate Israel, like the October 7th attack. It was only out of the rapid deployment of our forces on the 7th of October, both to the north and to the south, that we were able to prevent those infiltrations from being realized as a substantial attack, although we do have 2 officers that were killed in one of those exchanges. But they have launched something like 6,000 rockets, explosive drones. Even in the early hours of this morning, just today, And over the course of yesterday, there's something like 70 rocket attacks against northern Israel. How has Israel responded to this? First of all, the primary policy is a defensive posture. Defensive posture. We have thousands of rockets being fired. We've evacuated some 60,000 Israelis from the border towns in a contour of 5 kilometers from the border. They have no intention of going home until something substantially changes on that border. I have friends that live in Kibbutzim, Kibbutz Dafna, in Metula, in Kiryat Shmona, all in the northern, in Kabri. They have no death wish, and they can't go home. So the defensive posture is focused primarily to enable the Israeli defense establishment to deal with the primary arena, Gaza. But as we look forward and as we look towards the north, we realize that there are only two ways out of it: through diplomacy, again, or through military force. The scenario of a war that faces Hezbollah, they have something like 200,000 rockets, missiles, precision-guided missiles. They have the Radwan force, which is the special forces of Hezbollah that have battle experience from fighting in 2011, 2012 in Syria. And they have been also primed and prepared, equipped and trained by Iran. The ability of Hezbollah to bring in weaponry from Iran through Syria into Lebanon for Hezbollah is endless. And indeed, when I say that they are, Hamas looks amateur towards, it's not only in the magnitude, but it's also in the operational capabilities that this organization has. And so the question remains is, how will Israel deal with that? Diplomacy. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 dictated the security situation after the 2006 war with Hezbollah. That resolution was supposed to ensure that Hezbollah was not on the border, was not south of the Litani River, which is like 10 kilometers away from the border, did not have any weapons there, and that there was a United Nations peacekeeping force on the border in the area in the south of the southern Lebanon. And after I explained how the international community have failed us in Gaza, I would say that since October 8th, the United Nations peacekeeping force in Lebanon have failed Israel again. So the efforts today are, I would say, by the US administration, are to create a package deal, one that brings home the hostages, one that creates a ceasefire, an enduring ceasefire that will relieve Hamas from control of the Gaza Strip, but one that also creates a new reality in southern Lebanon. Will they be successful is the question that we all need to ask ourselves. And I would say, I hope so. Although, as a military man, we also say, hope is not a method. So we are, and I can say that the military today is preparing itself for a war that could develop also in the border with Lebanon. I can say that my friends, as I said, that live on the border with Lebanon have very little confidence that they can go back under a 1701.1 or 2 or 3. There is very little faith in the international system and its ability to deliver a better security for the people of Israel today. And I think also that the lack of faith in Israeli society towards the government, the military, and therefore also the international system is very, very challenging. I believe that that there needs to be a diplomatic arm and a military arm that work in tandem. I think the political goals and the military goals need to be concerted in order to achieve a regional development, which could include Saudi Arabia. I think there's prospects there for reopening the normalization. Hamas themselves admitted that their whole intention the 7th of October was to derail the process with Saudi Arabia, a process of normalization, which could have been a step forward in countering the Iranian attempts to create a regional power. And so I believe that the reality for us and the ability for Israel to create a new situation, a new security situation on the ground, has to work in tandem with international relations and the defense establishment that work to empower one another. But there will be no negotiations out of weakness, because our enemies see that weakness and they try to exploit it. What happened in the war against Israel before October 7th was Israel was giving Hamas, through the Qataris, money. We were allowing 18,000 workers to come in to work in Israel. Those were supposed to be good measures to create economic incentives to create safety and security for all. But they took advantage of that. And for us to conclude this war, and I don't see any end in sight, unless there is some sort of breakthrough before the elections in the US, for instance, there's an incentive there. But unless there is some sort of breakthrough there, then we will continue to be in conflict, and the war will continue until we bring home the 120 hostages, either through negotiations or special operations, military operations. Those are two very different results. We understand that hostages are dispersed throughout the Gaza Strip. We've conducted operations in Nuseirat and brought home hostages in Khan Yunis, in Sajaiya. It's an option, but they are limited in their scope. And there could be through negotiations, which means, like every negotiations, whatever you're bartering for, there's always going to be a compromise. But there are things that Israel can't compromise with, and with that in mind, we will continue to work in order to defeat Hamas. We have no choice. I never, ever intended to wear the uniform of the IDF ever again. I never thought that they would call on me to speak on behalf of the IDF, because I'd been critical of the IDF since I retired, because I think the only thing in my schedule prior to the October 7th was weekly protests in Israel against the government. But when October 7th happened, it brought all of the Israeli society together out of the understanding that this is an issue of survival. We have no choice. I would add, we have nowhere else to go. And I would add finally, before we open it to questions, we have no intention on going anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to our speaker, Peter Lerner. It's the first time I've intimidated a lieutenant colonel, so I think you've made my night tonight. Okay, so we're coming on to questions and discussion. So if you come up here, sir, and we'll be away. You've mentioned casualties and the impact on both on the people themselves, casualties, and on how Israel's looked at. Now, a Green Senator, Marique Faruqi, who's a senior Green Senator, went on Insiders a couple of weeks ago and, without being challenged by the presenter David Spears, said that Israel had slaughtered 40,000 Palestinians. Now, slaughtered is a certain word, but apart from that, often there's no differential made between civilians and fighters. So is that figure of 40,000 correct? And if it is correct, or even if it isn't correct, what would the percentage of fighters be out of that? It's like Israel are only fighting civilians, the way that line's presented.
Thank you. So I would say, first of all, to respond very clearly and frankly, nobody knows how many civilians have been killed in Gaza. Precisely because there is the fog of war, precisely because it is a dynamic environment, And precisely because the nature of war is that people get killed, civilians as well, and it is tragic. I can say that the amount of terrorists the IDF has confirmed that have been killed in this war is something around 14 to 15,000 terrorists. Now, the Hamas Ministry of Health, which, if you only listen to the media, won't necessarily realize that is the Hamas Ministry of Health, put out data. They put out data to the public that is consumed by the world media without question, and asked just recently, 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago, something like that, about the sources of their information. They admitted that at least 10,000 of those, of that number, it was then 38,000, are unverified deaths. Now, what does that mean? That means that the sourcing of their information is not based on anything. It's this gut feeling, a sense of somebody said something, somebody tweeted about it or posted about it on social media, not confirmed. We actually analyzed some of the lists that the Hamas Ministry of Health put out. And what we found was discrepancies in their reporting, their data sheets that they put out. For instance, obviously they don't identify anybody as a terrorist. Also, the terrorists don't identify as terrorists. They don't wear a uniform, and therefore, when they're killed in combat, their jeans, sneakers, and t-shirts, they look like civilians. So they're brought in, and when we were going through their list, we found men with their name and ID number. But when we checked the ID number, and on the table, they wrote that they were female. Or ages. It's important because they identify that over 50% of them were women and children. But in hindsight, even in their reviewed statistics, after they put out an announcement, it was actually less than 40% women and children. So we need to be very, very cautious, and I think I've encouraged all of the world media that I've engaged with throughout this war, during the time of my service, that no, we are fighting a merciless terrorist organization that has embedded itself intentionally in the civilian arena. No military has gone to the lengths in the history of warfare as Israel to evacuate civilians from harm's way. We did it despite the fact that in some cases, for instance, we distributed maps distinguishing and telling specific locations and neighborhoods they should evacuate to and where they should evacuate to. Military maps. We devised a system based on visual intelligence, based on open source intelligence, based on telecommunication surveillance, knowing how many people have evacuated from place to place. But in distributing a map, telling people where they need to evacuate from, we're basically telling the enemy where we're going to go to. So in effect, we're actually jeopardizing the safety of our forces. So civilian deaths in all wars are tragic. They are inevitable. And I would argue that if we just look at what we know, and even accept their numbers, I don't accept their numbers, but even I'll give you the benefit of that doubt, we're still at a ratio of about 1-to-1, maybe just a bit more than that, which is also unprecedented in modern war. You see, the Hamas terrorist organization has made the Gaza Strip their fortified position at every corner, at every junction. And that has been a huge challenge. But we, in turn, created the operational capabilities in order to try and address those. Do we expect the world to stand up and applaud us? I don't think so. Do we expect, and I can say from the relations and the communications we've had with like-minded militaries, they look at us in awe. People from Sandhurst, from West Point, and they say, you are setting a standard we can't live up to. And so it does not comfort those that have lost lives. And Palestinians that have lost lives, definitely not Israelis that have lost their lives in this war, and the soldiers that are losing their lives every single day. But I would say our obligation, both professionally and morally, is to continue to distinguish between civilians and terrorist organization, even though on the 7th of October, when we saw the Hamas abducting Israelis, young women, into the Gaza Strip, we saw civilians celebrating on the streets. We know not because we needed advanced intelligence capabilities, because they were live streaming it on their own social media. And so there is a challenge here. It's a challenge also politically and internally in Israel. Who are the civilians of Gaza? Do they support Hamas? There are polling that suggests that everybody supports Hamas. But as a professional military, we have a duty and an obligation to seek out those that are armed, to seek out, attack, and kill those that are intending to conduct more atrocities against us. And I would say that, yes, we're doing a good job. And war has consequences. If you decide to pick a war with Israel, you have to realize that there are going to be consequences. I'll try and keep those shorter, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for the amazing job you did, and congratulations on the work that you were doing for the last 8 months. But the war that Israel seems to be losing is the international communications law, war. And part of that is because the world gets fed from Al Jazeera, and as you know, the mouthpiece of Hamas. The question I have is, given that there is a single channel of information coming out of Gaza, which is the mouthpiece of Hamas, what was the strategic decision that the IDF took not to embed journalists to be able to counteract that narrative during its operations and tell the true story of what was actually happening?
Thank you, Paul. So I would say, first of all, we have extensively embedded journalists together with the forces. But keeping in mind that an embed in Israel is a half an hour's drive into Gaza, they get their story and they can be out by dinner on the beach enjoying a beer in Tel Aviv after they've already filed their story. So we don't have thousands of miles of way to conduct a traditional embed, which creates the rapport between forces and the journalists, that there's an identification, but rather a much more delicate situation that requires a distinctive thought process. One question I had during the course of this war is, what is more damaging to Israel, Al Jazeera or TikTok? And I would say that one complements the other. The stories begin on TikTok. They are then picked up by Al Jazeera that amplify them, that are then picked up by the world media in general, sometimes with clarification and verification, many times without. And I think that the international media effort needs to be addressed on 2 levels. I think, practically speaking, and from my experience over the course of many years, and I was a spokesperson in 2014, in the last major war with Hamas, and in the last 9 months now, and over the 8 months that I was serving, Israel has been better at being able to deliver the media product. We've been there. You've seen me on television. I've been able to speak on behalf. We were generally welcomed into, even if they criticized or asked tough questions, or in Sarah Ferguson's case, I don't believe what you're saying. I believe that is not the issue. I think the bigger issue is not being able to give access or be available to the media. It's what story is Israel telling from a strategic perspective. Not how eloquent or well-versed the spokesperson is, but rather, what are we trying to achieve at the end of this? You see, there are 4 components of legitimacy in modern warfare. The first is exhaustion of negotiations. So obviously, 7th of October, there was no negotiations to exhaust. They did it. Second is there a credible threat? That was also realized on the 7th of October. Third is proportionality in warfare, which is always a sticking point for Israel, because we are judged more severely than most. And most journalists don't understand the concept of proportionality in warfare. They think it's a numbers issue, to relate to the last question. And finally, they want to know that at the end of the war, there will be a change. And I think, and I mentioned this during my short briefing, we need to ensure that we're not back at square one, that Hamas doesn't remain in power, but there is a Palestinian civilian authority that is responsible for demilitarization, but also responsible for de-radicalization of the Gaza Strip. And only then can there be any prospect of peace. And so, yeah, that is, in very broad strokes, an issue of policy and not PR practitioners. Because, as I said, I think we had an army of very well capable spokespeople, from former Ambassador Mark Regev to Elon Levy, the talented guy with the eyebrows, and in the military, myself and my colleague Jonathan Conricus. There were definitely in English, we were able, and we did it in German, we did it in Spanish, we did it in French. It's not what you say, it's what they hear. And I think there is importance to be very, very clear about what is the political outcome of this war that we are trying to achieve. And I think sometimes we were under-equipped to deliver that message.
You spoke about Egypt and also about tunnels. And I was wondering if you could reflect on what was discovered when the Philadelphia Road was taken over, and in light of the suggestion that the Egyptian political and military establishment were taking a percentage of the smuggling that was going through, which meant that there was arms and other things coming that way.
Very good question, thank you. Egypt is an active player on this battlefield, but they are trying to be behind the scenes. They have interests in the tunnel industry that took place. Some of it you alluded to with funds. But not only, I think they use that as also a type of pressure valve to release some of the pressure that is inside Gaza. I believe that together with the fact that Israel was facilitating Qatari money to go into Gaza, they worked in tandem. So it was all about trying to relieve some of the pressure and trying to relieve some of the challenges and turning a blind eye to some of the weaponry going in, although in hindsight that was clearly a strategic and operational mistake. What we found to date, and they're still investigating tunnels, at least 20 cross-border tunnels between the Gaza Strip and Rafah. The Gaza Strip and Rafah, the Gazan side and the Egyptian side. And those operations are continuing. I believe that we need to maintain control over the Rafah corridor, the Philadelphia corridor as it's known, not necessarily over the border itself. There can be an international solution for the border itself. There was in the past. In 2006, I was a young liaison officer to international organizations to the Gaza Strip. One of the missions I coordinated was the European Border Assistance Mission, which was competent people, mixed security, Europeans, a good balance between security, defense, and civilians. And it was a mechanism that worked to monitor who was going through. When Hamas took over, they kicked them out. And therefore, we lost every influence over what was happening at the border. But it can be reestablished, together with some Palestinians from the Palestinian Authority that also needs to be reviewed and revamped. The reality, though, that I believe is that the Philadelphia corridor needs to be held by Israel, at least for the foreseeable future, As I said, demilitarization and de-radicalization is the key. And in order to make sure that it is demilitarized, there needs to be control over the Philadelphia corridor.
Peter, I'm interested in your thoughts on the role of the Gulf states in resolving this nightmare. They seem to have played very little role so far. Is there a possibility in the future?
I hope so. I think that what we've seen from the Gulf states throughout this war is they have brought medical facilities into Gaza, so they have field hospitals. They have conducted airdrops of food supplies. They have facilitated the flow of medicine and food supplies and continued donations to UNRWA. So that has been what's happening in the course of the war. I think in the aftermath of the war, and the government has alluded to this, the government would like them to be a substantial part of the rebuilding of Gaza. I think it is part. Here's what I know. The idea that the Emirates can be part and parcel, I think, needs to be part of a broader package deal together with Saudi Arabia, perhaps together with Jordan, and I think Egypt also needs to step up in this. And like many of the regional players, together with the United States and the United Kingdom, came to Israel's support when Iran attacked us in March, there can be a global and regional alliance to rebuild Gaza in, I would say, an image of de-radicalization and demilitarization. So I would hope that they would be part.
I've got a couple of Zoom questions. I can't get through them all, but one very brief one I think you can handle. There's a question: is Israel capable of eliminating Hamas's role in Gaza within a time scale that will withstand international pressures?
We don't have a choice. I don't think that time is the biggest concern to Israel. The concern to Israel is making sure that Hamas can't do it again. Is that quick enough?
Yep, that's great.
Peter, what motivates the Iranian theocracy deep down? I mean, is it a Sunni versus Shia tussle? Is it a geopolitical battle against America with its proxy Israel? Is it an attempt at propaganda to distract the Iranian population? I've been there many times. It's a wonderful country, and yet it seems to be so perverse in its international activities.
Thank you. I would say all of the above. You put a lot of things on the roster there, but I would say Iran wants to increase its global standing. It does it through fuel, it does it through terrorist influence, it does it through regional and global meddling. And I think when we see the Iranian influence, their attempt to grow, it's because they want to restore the old days of influence. How much room at the table does the world give them, I think, is a very important question. And will they ever be held accountable for the bad things they get up to? So instead of being perhaps a positive player, that they could have been, they are bent on the destruction of Israel, little Satan, and they don't really like the big Satan either much. So I think when we look at all of those put together, we have to realize that Iran, until somebody significant enough stops them in their tracks, they're going to continue to do what they're doing. And this, I think, is the biggest concern that we have.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the West Bank and the Jewish settlers there and all the problems in that part of Israel? Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, I think this is being sidelined because of the war. There are a couple of issues regarding the West Bank or Judea and Samaria that need to be addressed. I think the fundamental issue is the security situation is unstable. It's unstable because there is a weak Palestinian Authority. It's unstable because Hamas is raising its head in that region. It's unstable because of policies of the Israeli government in that region with regard to expanding settlements, which undermines the faith or the international faith in a peace process that would eventually create a two-state solution, or as some call it, a two-state delusion. So the situation today, as I see it, is one where there is extensive instability, that Palestinian violence outnumbers Jewish-Israeli violence tenfold, that the motivations to conduct terrorist attacks from the West Bank as a staging ground towards Israeli communities and settlements or Israeli towns is extensive. Some of it is indeed aggravated by Iran. And therefore, if we want, I think, and I believe, in my experience as I served many years in the West Bank, both in the civil administration and the IDF Central Command, a strong Palestinian Authority is important. It needs to be a Palestinian Authority that does not celebrate acts of terrorism. And I think when the United States administration, President Biden, is talking about a reformed Palestinian Authority, he's alluding to that. We need a Palestinian Authority that also celebrates life, but does not only commemorate Palestinian martyrs with roundabouts and squares and celebrates them. Of course, the Israeli government need to have a vision of living side by side in coexistence with Palestinians. And unfortunately, this government, and for many years now, it's been very hard to realize that type of vision. Not only because of politics, also because the Israeli public is generally very suspicious of the Palestinian Authority, because the last time peace was talked about ended up in a huge intifada with suicide bombs in the heart of Tel Aviv, in Afula, in Haifa, in Jerusalem. And so the faith in that process can only be realized if there is a credible partner on the other side. But it takes two to tango.
Getting very close to the end. There's a question.
Thank you, Peter. My question is about tunnels, and this is partly bear in mind that I'm a post-war baby and of the prisoners of war camps, and the men would go into huts and build tunnels under the ground. I had heard that there was extensive tunnelling in the Israelis were surprised to find extensive tunnelling in Gaza. And at different levels of ground. How is it possible? Was it a surprise, the tunnelling that the Israelis found in Gaza? And why was it possible to build these tunnels? And, for example, where would they take the material that's taken out? Wouldn't that provide evidence to people?
So first of all, Israel had no presence in the Gaza Strip, so Hamas could have done whatever they want. Secondly, I would say, no, we're not surprised by the extent of their tunnel system. We knew that they had built extensively. We developed techniques, technologies, and tactics to confront counter or subterranean activities. So no, I would not say we were surprised. I would not say that the extent. Of course, we did not have all of the intelligence where all of the tunnels were. We've revealed to the world time and time again the extent of these tunnels and shown the magnitude, bigger than this room, a tunnel that you can drive a car through, and indeed where some of the hostages were held beneath ground. So they had strategic tunnels for existing beneath ground for many hours, many days, many weeks, and tactical tunnels that helped them get from A to B. The question of where they were hiding some of the rubble, and I think we all have this understanding of there's a need for it to be evacuated. And indeed, in some cases, our intelligence, our visual intelligence, picked up rubble being removed. Or in some cases, when we've come to locations, specifically, I would say, or more extensively in the area of Rafah, we came into houses where the whole house was rubble inside, but an access point into the ground. So they brought the rubble out and they just left it within the house. So that and that's not just unique to Rafah. We've seen it elsewhere as well, because they're aware and know that we are surveilling from the sky. Tunnel warfare is a huge challenge. It's not new in our region. The Gaza Strip, they always had tunnels. Since 1967, they had smuggling tunnels on the border with Egypt. And throughout the years, they developed them into attack tunnels, explosive tunnels. They used to build tunnels beneath our positions, pack them with explosives and detonate them from beneath. The infiltration tunnels into Israel, as I said, 2014, and the defensive tunnels, which is being realized in this war, is that how they use the civilian arena to conceal themselves and try and prolong their existence. Time is against them.
Just a final, very quick question, a difficult question, but I'll give you a try at answering it. If you were coming back here in a year, what do you think you might be able to report, realistically?
I have an hour. I know what I hope. I hope that my daughter will not have to be woken up ever again by the sounds of sirens. I hope that my friends that live on the border in Kibbutz Dafna can return to their homes safely and securely. And I hope that Hamas will be a distant memory of a diabolical organization that had no good intentions about anything for anyone in the region. That was an easy one. Thank you very much.
So there are a lot of people here tonight, so I'll be very brief. Many thanks to Peter Lerner for a great presentation tonight. Very informative, and we learnt a lot. And good luck for the future. We'd love to have you back. Okay.